What is up, everybody? Welcome back to Rough Drafts. My name is Sam Pratt, and this is Cube 201. So last week I released Cube 101, which was mostly focused on sort of comparing Booster Draft to Cube, kind of selling Cube to people who mostly play Booster Draft Limited, and sort of exploring the differences of how to shift your thinking from one format to the other. This episode is going to be more drilling into how to gain an edge on other Cube drafters strategically. So this is going to be a lot more specific strategic advice that's building on the fundamentals of card evaluation that we talked about last week. So this episode's kind of going to be doing three different things. One is that I want to give a little bit of strategic advice for Cube. First of all, because CubeCon 2025 is this weekend, I will be in attendance. My own cube is one of the main event cubes. And I've kind of noticed that a lot of the Cube content scene, like the Cube podcasts, are mostly focused on Cube curation, rather than like strategic advice of how to approach drafting a cube, which, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think this episode is going to kind of fill a niche role like that. And the other aspect of this episode that I'm excited to share is I want to showcase sort of the Cube world to players that are maybe only familiar with like the traditional Magic Online Vintage Cube, Magic Arena cubes. There's so much cool stuff happening in Cube right now out there that I've gotten really into over the past like 6 months. So we're going to be talking about sort of general strategic advice for Cube, but also how to apply that to certain genres of Cube. So I'm talking like cubes that focus on a certain era of Magic, cubes that play with 1, 2, or 3 colors only, cubes that have like rules modifications, etc. So the first big piece of strategic advice that I want to talk about is a very simple one, and it's just play the good cards. Going to go on a little bit of an anecdote about this. I was preparing the notes for this episode, and I was reminded of, or maybe someone showed it to me this week, there's an article by Sam Black that he wrote for Hipsters of the Coast after CubeCon 2023, where he talks about his cube strategy. And then I was reminded of a Drafting Archetypes episode from 2022, where he also talks about Cube after his experience at the first CubeCon that year. And he basically says the same things in each piece of content, and it basically boils down to pick the good cards and put them in your deck. So just play the good cards, play the good cards. In the podcast episode after the first CubeCon, he talks a lot about what he calls Cube staples, which are cards that you know are really powerful because you see them played in Constructed. Like these are like popular cards that people include in their cubes because they're kind of iconic. And they're really powerful because they've like seen play in Constructed. And he was a little bit critical of the cube designers at the time, because like the examples he gave were there were like a lot of cubes that were supposedly synergy based. So like this cube has like a discard theme. So the cube designer put in Fable of the Mirror Breaker to support that discard theme. Or like this cube has a +1/+1 counters theme. So here's the Great Henge. And his strategy at these cube events at the time was, I'm just going to pick the best cards. You know, Fable of the Mirror Breaker is going to be one of the best cards in your deck in any cube, basically. And he's just going to focus on picking the best cards and then figuring stuff out later. And he was focused on just picking the best cards and figuring out his deck around those, when a lot of the people at his tables were really like tunneling in on a specific synergy early on and trying to build that deck. And there's just like so much risk of that. It's kind of like Booster Draft Limited too, where like if someone else at the table is in your same lane trying to do that, you're both are going to train wreck or you're going to have to pivot. Whereas if you just focus on the most powerful cards, like you're going to be able to just cast those generically powerful cards and do well. So he was like very lightly critical of designers and other players at the time. And I actually think that cube design and like cube curation in the past couple of years has grown a lot. From what I've seen, like people are a lot more eager to cut these power outliers, these like obvious quote unquote staples from constructed formats when they're designing more synergy based or lower powered cubes. But I do think that this philosophy of play the good cards, just pick the good cards and put them in your deck, is really going to be like a backdrop of everything we talk about today. This is something that I talk a lot about in my own cube and my own cube design philosophy, which is I'm giving players powerful cards, and you can use these powerful cards to support certain synergies. So, like Fable of the Mirror Breaker is a really good card to support your discard synergies, but you're going to be drafting as in you take Fable first, and then later on you see that the discard lane is open, and then you can use Fable to support that theme, rather than you slam Monument to Endurance, pack one, pick one, and then hope that you open a Fable later on. Like the player that starts with Fable is going to have a more powerful deck. Now this might seem to conflict with my advice from last week of your deck in most cubes really needs to do a thing to be about a thing. But I want to be clear that I think that the direction that you want to go in navigating your drafts in most cube drafts is finding some sort of powerful cards or a couple powerful cards and figuring out what you can do in a certain lane to build the deck around it, rather than starting in a narrow thing and building towards it. You're sort of just grab some powerful cards, grab some flexible fixing, and sort of navigate into an open lane that supports these powerful cards that you start with. Very much an outside-in drafting approach. So I'm really glad I was reminded of these couple of pieces of content from Sam Black from a couple of years ago, because I think that the backdrop of really just you want to prioritize the good cards early. You don't want to get caught up in some sort of weird synergy lane early and kind of train wreck. Strategically, the most foolproof way to approach any cube, of which there are so many different types, is to just look for very generically powerful cards and sort of use those as the cornerstones of your deck and sort of build your deck around them to support them rather than the other way. And I think Fable of the Mirror Breaker is such a perfect example for this. That card does so many little things. It makes tokens if you care about tokens, it makes artifacts, it's an enchantment, it discards cards, it can flicker your enters the battlefield abilities with the backside. But it's also just kind of an obscenely strong card. And it's going to be the most powerful card in your deck in just pretty much every cube draft ever. So we're going to get into the meat of the episode now. I can tell that this episode is going to be pretty long. Usually I have 2 pages of notes and I have 4 today. So I'm going to move things along. We're going to be talking about different, what I'm calling genres of cubes. Last week, a lot of the discussion was centered around these big public cubes like the Vintage Cube or the Arena Cube. I'm going to use this opportunity to showcase a lot of the different things that people are doing in the cube space that are more creative, and using this to demonstrate how to shift your context for each of these genres and how to approach drafting cubes like this. I was initially planning on taking examples from the cubes available in the KubeCon main event, but I decided that the example cubes I'm going to use are mostly pulling from my friends' cubes. 1, because it's fun to shout them out, and 2, because I've actually drafted them, and I'm quite familiar with a lot of them. So the first big bucket I'm going to talk about are cubes that are defined by a certain format or era of Magic or even a rarity. So I'm talking about a pauper cube, a peasant cube, a modern cube, etc. I would say that my own cube, my Arena legal cube, which is all of the cards available both on Arena and in paper, so no alchemy, this vaguely falls into this category as well. And I'm starting with this big bucket of cubes because I think this is the simplest one to approach, because nowhere else is just play the good cards more apt. I think if you're approaching a cube like this, if you're familiar with the card pool in which it is referencing, so say you're drafting a modern cube, if you're familiar at all with the types of cards and decks that are good in modern, you should know what's good in this cube. Likely the cards that are good in those card pools are also going to be good in this specific cube. So if I was drafting a modern cube, I would be on the lookout for stuff like Psychic Frog, a Johnny, etc. Obviously, people are doing different things in this space, but in terms of just strategic advice for approaching these cubes, I think it's really just boils down to just a generic play the good cards, take the good cards first, and figure it out like we've been talking about for this whole episode. For rarity restricted cubes, this most likely is talking about pauper cubes and peasant cubes, so cubes with only commons or uncommons. I think you can approach it very similarly. For a pauper cube, you kind of want to think about what the power outliers for each of those rarities is going to be. There is a difference between a cube that is maybe titled like the peasant cube, which would generally be like, I'm going to play all of the strongest uncommons available to me, versus like a cube that might be doing something creative at that rarity. So like, this is my synergy cube that only uses peasant cards. And I think there's a little bit of difference in the way you would approach that, or at least the way that you would like navigate the draft. So the former is like a peasant cube that you're playing all of the strongest cards available to you at that rarity. Last year at CubeCon, I drafted someone's cube that was a cube like this. It was like power maxing the peasant space, but it actually broke the peasant rarity for fetch land, shock land, mana base. Like, it used rare lands. And this very much felt like I was drafting closer to like maybe like a pioneer level cube. It had like mana leak, lightning bolt. So this was a very easy cube for me to navigate, just because I'm familiar with a lot of cards in Magic and I know like iconic ones that are strong. You can approach this very traditionally like that. My friend Arthur has a peasant cube that is very much more about synergy and finding your lane. So he has very clearly defined archetypes, like black-red is like a sacrifice deck, white-red is an equipment deck, like the green-black has a graveyard deck. You're still going to approach this with pick the good cards first, and figure out your lane later. But there's a lot more of like draft lane navigation in this in terms of like a synergy space. Because you really don't want to be in the same synergy lane as someone. Whereas the previous cube that I talked about, the one with the rare lands that was very much power maxed peasant cube, I remember that draft. I think there were 3 blue-red drafters at the table. I was one of them, and I trophied, and it was fine because it wasn't like super synergy forward. It was just kind of like play the good cards. So that's something to watch out for, is the rarity restriction like sort of the defining aspect of the cube, or is it just like one aspect of many? Another genre that kind of falls into this big bucket of like external classifications would be cubes that are targeting a specific era of Magic. And this also, very simply, I don't think you have to change things that much from like a Pioneer cube. If you are familiar with that card pool, if you're familiar of the card pool of the era that this is targeting, then you should be able to identify what are the strongest cards of that era and focus on those. For example, my friend Justin recently put together a cube that we've drafted a bunch of times so far, called Standard Greatest Hits, where the restriction was every card in the cube has to have top 8'd a Pro Tour or Worlds from the introduction of Planeswalkers up until War of the Spark. So Lorwyn to War of the Spark. And the first time I drafted this, which was only a couple weeks ago, my pack one pick one had Jace the Mind Sculptor, which is a card that has kind of fallen off in like super high powered cubes like Vintage Cube, or even like My Arena Cube. Like Jace isn't like a slam dunk pack one pick one, but in this cube, like Jace the Mind Sculptor was like banned in Modern for this whole time, and I slammed that pack one pick one. So adjusting your expectations based on the card pool available is very important there. A big genre of cube that I'm going to fully admit I am not experienced in this and I don't have great advice is cubes that are targeting old school Magic. So I started playing Magic in like 2005, 2006. I was never playing when Old Border was like the thing. And I know this is a type of cube that's been really popular recently. I think same as always, if you're familiar with that card pool, you can lean on your knowledge. A good example of a cube like this is Andy from Lucky Paper Radio has a neoclassical cube that isn't strictly all old cards. Like he has cards like Burst Lightning that sort of fit the vibe of old school cards, but it's very much to replicate like old school 90s Magic. And it's actually unsleeved, which is very cool as well. But I know from him talking about this cube on his podcast that there are a lot of things that are different about old Magic that you'd have to pay attention to. For example, some of the control decks just like straight up don't play any creatures. So creature removal or board wipes are often pretty risky main deck cards, or like less of a priority because there are matchups where you sideboard them out completely, which I thought was really interesting. And I think that like also slower decks really need a plan to win. Like slower decks can be very strong, but he mentioned that like sometimes Stroke of Genius, which is 2 and a blue, X, target player draws X cards. Like this was often a control win con targeting your opponent. Which is just like mind blowing to me. Like I cannot imagine playing a game of Magic like that. But yeah, that's something that I will admit I have no experience in, but I know that that is a big context shift to be aware of. The next big genre bucket of cubes is cubes that are color restricted. So this would be cubes that are like monocolor, like a mono red cube, or maybe a cube that is 3 colors, like a Teamer cube. You know, I've seen some 2-color cubes. I know there's a couple at CubeCon. I tend to see mostly monocolor or 3-color. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I think 2-color, you know, obviously is just kind of in the middle, maybe a little closer to monocolor. I'll start by talking about monocolor cubes. I think you need to think hard about not only what that particular color does well, but also what that particular color lacks. And I think the lack is more important because it bumps up the cards that do that thing a lot more. Now, this is extremely vague. If I was drafting a mono blue cube, I would take powerful creatures a lot more highly than I normally do because blue tends to not get powerful creatures. My friend Arthur, mentioned previously, has a mono white cube that I've drafted a couple times. So white is really good at deploying a lot of creatures, and it is also really good at removing a lot of creatures. So there's like a lot of token generation. There's also a lot of board wipes. White is not good at card advantage. So card advantage engines can be really important if you're building a control deck. And I don't want to say white is bad at evasion because flying is evasion. But in the mono white cube, when you're only playing with white cards, the flying tends to be a lot more common. So cards having flying was a lot less of a big deal than it would be in a normal color balanced environment. My first draft of this cube, I drafted a pretty generic white aggro deck that I thought was going to be really strong. Like it had the traditional white aggro cards like Adeline that are just like very generically strong cards. But what I found was I was getting into board stalls a lot because my opponents were also able to deploy a wide board, or I was getting my board wiped very easily. Just, you know, because white has a lot of cards like Wrath of God. So I found that this traditional white aggro strategy that's really powerful in a lot of color balance cubes was not actually good when it was only playing against other white cards. My second draft of this cube, I drafted a really cool like artifact aggro-ish deck. So it was leaning really hard into artifact cards like Steel Overseer. I had a Tempered Steel to like make a wide board of Thopters or something, and was able to kill in really tight windows before I could get board wiped. I had like Stoneforge Mystic Batterskull as sort of like a value engine in a board stall as well. In this deck in particular, Ginger Brute was extremely good because I had equipment to suit it up, and its unblockable ability was so much more important as evasion than flying was normally in this cube. So I was really happy with how I adjusted my expectations of an aggro deck in this cube. And I hope that this like specific example helps you kind of think about what you should be thinking about if you draft a color restricted cube. A couple other random notes about monocolor cubes, specifically your mana base. You can plan to play 16 lands because you only need to account for 1 color of mana, or even 15 lands. And unless you have cards that are like triple white, you can prioritize colorless utility lands way higher. Like I was playing like 5 colorless utility lands or like creature lands because like when you're a monocolored deck, you really only need like 11 sources of that color to like cast your spells reliably. Spending a little bit of time talking about 3-color cubes. In my experience, 3-color cubes honestly don't draft that much differently than a normal 5-color cube, but you have way more flexibility in the draft because there are so fewer lanes that you can end up in. So my example for this one is my friend Matt's Bug Cube or Sultai Cube, if you're not a Magic Boomer. So this cube is kind of like Legacy Cube vibes. So it's not powered. It doesn't have like Power 9, but it's basically like as powerful as you can get beyond that. So there's a lot of combo aspect. The last time I drafted this, I took a channel, pack one, pick one. And I remember thinking like, okay, I'm probably going to be green, but I was still like really taking just the most powerful card in the pack for way longer than I normally would, kind of not caring about color balance because I knew that there was only like a couple of lanes that I needed to end up in. Basically, if I wanted to play the channel, I just wanted to avoid strictly blue-black. I could end up in mono green or blue green or black green. So I just kind of really focused on taking the most powerful cards, picking up the pieces that support channel like the Eldrazi and stuff, and really not worrying about the colors of the cards I was taking. Just because like there's only so many lanes you can end up in these 3-color cubes. Okay, next genre bucket. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about desert cubes. This is the name the community has given to cubes where basic lands are not available to you after the draft, meaning you have to draft all of the lands that you play. This is something that's been picking up steam in the past like 5 years or so. I've actually never drafted a full desert cube. So I'm doing my best to give like strategic advice. I have heard that these are very mentally taxing. I have done some practice drafts of these, so I have a little bit of experience. Still, take the good cards, of course, but I do think that the good lands leapfrog a lot of the like middle picks where you're just kind of like taking a card to like fill your curve or like a medium removal spell. I think you really want to evaluate the strength of the lands because there's like a really wide range of what a desert cube could be about. There could be a desert cube that's really powerful. It's got like fetches and shocks and stuff. And in which case fetch lands, I think I would take over basically everything. But I've also seen a lot of desert cubes that are like medium to lower power and also don't have like the really powerful mana base. If I were to draft one of those, I would take flexible lands very, very highly. So something like Ash Barrens or Evolving Wild. I also know that lands that enter untapped in these environments can be a really big deal. And I think that because of that, just because of like the scarcity of lands in general, that makes like the untapped lands that much better. And I know that basics in particular, which are often available to you in the draft, can be way more important than people realize. Just being able to cast your spells on curve is such a big deal. I also know that in these types of drafts, it can be kind of really helpful to pace yourself. So if you're drafting with 3 packs, if you just make sure that you pick up 6 lands per pack to get 18 at the end of the draft, I know that that can sort of take a big mental load off of you. Like I said, I haven't drafted one of these. I'm definitely going to try to draft at least one at KubeCon this weekend. But I hope the stuff I've just said is helpful nonetheless. There are a lot of cubes that are more out there. I'm kind of bucketing all of the rest of these into one big like out there bucket, like kind of wacky cube bucket. There's no formula I can give you for these. These are going to be more difficult to draft. You really need to think hard about the ramifications and what unique things come out of what the cube is doing. Really think hard about what becomes a higher priority for these cubes. Before I get into specific examples, one thing I know about these types of cubes is that reading the overview on Cube Cobra can be extremely helpful. I know that the designers of these types of cubes often know that they're very difficult to draft and will often give strategic advice for drafting these cubes in the overview. So an example of a cube like this, I'm kind of burying the lead on the specific examples. There's a cube called the Cascade Cube, which is a cube where each player starts with an emblem of Maelstrom Nexus in play, which reads, the first spell you cast each turn has Cascade. First of all, something that changes in this cube is that instants become extremely powerful because you can cascade on your opponent's turn and your turn, and that you have to be really picky about your 1-drops. So for example, Swords to Plowshares, they mention, is a sideboard card often because it is the type of card that you can often cascade into and have no legal targets. A lot of these cubes I haven't drafted, I've just heard about. That's just an example of something where reading the overview can be really helpful. Another similar kind of rules modified cube is Anthony from Lucky Paper Radio has a cube called Turbo Cube, where each player is an emblem where spells and abilities cost 2 less. And one of the big things that comes out of this is that cards that are like eggs, so for example, Guild Globe, become extremely powerful. So Guild Globe is a common artifact from War of the Spark. It is 2 mana. When it enters, draw a card, and you can pay 2 and sack it to add 2 mana of different colors. So basically, because its ability and its cost are reduced by 2, this is a 0 mana artifact that taps, sacks for 2 mana, and draws a card. So it is pretty close to better than Black Lotus. So obviously this environment gets extremely generate very quickly. If you read the overview, or if you've heard him talk about this on the Lucky Paper, you know that the play pattern is often like dump your hand, draw a ton of cards, and then finish with a lock piece. So a card like Archon of Emeria, which reads players can't cast more than 1 spell, and then you pass the turn to your opponent and they can't do the same thing. So obviously that's like a play pattern that you might want to go for, or that you might want to be prepared for your opponent to go for. Another example of a cube that doesn't have a rules modification but has a very large context shift is, still talking about Lucky Paper, the famous 100 Ornithopters, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a cube where there are 100 Ornithopters. That's the only creature in the cube. That's the only way to win. You have to figure out how to win with your Ornithopters. It's often like putting counters on it, building some sort of engine by like tapping them or something, or suiting them out with equipment. And the big context shift strategic piece of advice that comes out of this is that disenchants become extremely powerful because they're not just kill spells for the Ornithopters themselves, but oftentimes the engines are enchantments, or the things that are actually able to win are like equipment. So the disenchants become much more flexible disruption pieces because of this environment. So these are just a couple scattered examples. One, because I want to show off the cool things that are happening in the cube scene. And 2, because I think they're good examples of ways you have to recontextualize familiar cards in these kind of wackier environments. I think all 3 of these previous examples are also cubes where you want to think really hard about your land count. And often I know that these cubes, you want to play like 12, 13, 14 lands, which is a very non-standard number. Just like these rules modifications give you reasons to cut lands. So that's another wrinkle that you need to consider when you're like drafting and building your deck. A more familiar example to me of like a cube that dramatically shifts the context is my friend Max's cube, affectionately known as Piss Cube, where every card in it is multicolor. And it's also a desert cube, but you're given 5 basic lands at the start, and then you have to draft every other land in your deck. The vibes are very silly on this one, but I decided my first draft to take it pretty seriously. And I thought about it for a while, and I realized that the actual threats, like the cards that I was picking to like cast and win the game, like them being like gold cards and just like all pretty powerful, meant they're really interchangeable. So I focused in the draft really hard on mana acceleration. So I picked up a lot of talismans early. I ended up playing about 20 mana sources total. I think it was 15 lands, 5 mana rocks. And for my mana base, I basically only took triomes and untapped lands. So kind of like desert cubes, I really focused on only the good lands. And I also played all 5 of my basics. And I just sort of expected my deck to be full 5 color, Whereas a lot of other people drafting were kind of like trying to lock in on a specific 3-color wedge. And I treated this draft a lot like you would treat like the chromatic cube on Arena, which is a cube I don't personally draft, but I know that mana acceleration to get ahead is really important, and the cards that you're actually winning with are all pretty much interchangeable. So I think that's a pretty good example of another spot where what the good cards are changes from like the cards that are winning the game to the cards that are like enabling you to win the game in like mana acceleration. And that was like my last big bucket. I kind of only covered cubes that fit neatly into genres. There's like a lot of really good ideas for cubes out there that are just like, here's a vague like vibe of Magic cards I'm putting in my cube, that are awesome. So some examples that I've drafted are the Chicago Cube, which is designed by a couple people that have organized this like weekly cube meetup here in Chicago. The Chicago Cube is like kind of medium power level, very synergy heavy. Like there's a ton of like graveyard and token and artifact stuff. That's a fantastic cube. It's very well maintained. There's also a cube I drafted recently by a friend of mine named Tom called El Clasico. That's intentionally supposed to play closer to normal limited Magic, kind of like a Masters set, but not rarity restricted at all. And it uses like face down mechanics in Morph and Disguise pretty heavily. That's a very, very fun cube to draft as well. Neither of these cubes really fit into like a certain genre. They're just kind of like cool cubes with a certain vibe. So I'm really just saying this all to say there's a ton of cool stuff out there. I would really recommend exploring it. I'm extremely excited to go to CubeCon this weekend. This will be my second CubeCon and my first time playing the entire main event. I was actually in Madison, Wisconsin 3 years ago for the first CubeCon, but I was getting married instead of attending CubeCon. And then I was doing anniversary stuff the year after. And then I had just adopted my second dog last year. So I missed day one. So I'm very excited to do the entire main event. So if you're going to CubeCon, seek me out. I'm the tall white guy with long hair and a beard. That should identify me very easily. So feel free to say hi, and I would love to hear feedback if anyone gets to draft my cube in particular in the main event. And that's going to wrap it up. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me on Blue Sky at sampratt.bsky.social, samp6 on Discord. Thanks for listening. See you next week.